all 5 platforms. This last chapter, chapter 18, is called The Teacher. Just a few months after I traveled to Gaza to cover the 51-day war, I was dining at an upscale Italian restaurant in Berkeley, California, with literature professor Rafat Al-Arir, who usually lives in Gaza City. We had been invited there by the Lenan Foundation, a Santa Fe, New Mexico-based foundation that supports a mix of artistic endeavors and progressive political causes. I had just delivered a talk on my book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel, in San Francisco, beside the Palestinian-American author and activist Ali Abu Nima. For his part, Rafat had been touring the U.S. with a group of Palestinian authors from Gaza to promote the compilation of essays he had edited, Gaza Writes Back. We had followed closely on each other's heels throughout the book tours that spring. When I spoke at Western Washington University, a picturesque campus on the U.S. border with Canada, I was peppered with questions by a Jewish American undergrad who seemed to have never encountered a critical analysis of Israel or Zionism and was clearly anguished by my presentations. A week later, I learned from Rafat that the same student had cried openly as he and 2 other young writers from Gaza, Youssef Al-Jamal and Rawan Yahi, described growing up under the siege to the campus audience. By the time we gathered at the long dining table in downtown Berkeley, everyone seemed to be struggling with varying levels of exhaustion and bewilderment from our long cross-country tours. I felt slightly uncomfortable seated beside 3 young people on a brief furlough from the Gaza ghetto before crystal goblets of Merlot and smooth wooden boards of artisanal cheese spread out on white tablecloths. But I quickly forgot my unease as I fell into conversation with Rafat. We spent the next hour chatting about his impressions of the vast and blindingly colorful country he had just barnstormed across. The American landscape had offered Rafat the chance to meet Jews who did not greet him from behind the barrel of an M16, from inside the cockpit of an F-16, or from the turrets of a Merkava tank, or behind the occupation administrator's desk. Rafat described how life under occupation in Gaza had produced his, quote, Malcolm X moment, and how his visit to the U.S. helped him emerge from it, just as Malcolm X began questioning his prejudices after experiencing the fraternity with the whites he met on his pilgrimage to Mecca, which, his autobiography is so good. I highly recommend it, and that is mentioned there as well. That's Malcolm X's autobiography. So continuing, quote, when Malcolm X was in prison, his sister told him, Elijah Muhammad said in Islam, that is the true religion of black people, and the white man is the devil, end quote. He thought of every white person he had ever met in his life and realized that he had been harmed in one way or another by every one of them. Rafat explained, quote, this is what's happening to us in Palestine, because you never come face to face with a Jewish person who's not armed to the teeth trying to kill you, and that makes it very hard to break with your prejudices, end quote. When Rafat traveled across the United States, he met for the first time with Jews who treated him with empathy. Quote, when you talk to Jewish people about their lives, they host you in their homes, you spend time with their families, and they educate you in ways beyond imagination. Because they know about Israel, about Jewish life, about Zionism, he marveled. Quote, you learn so much because they are insiders. It was the tour to America that changed me in so many ways, end quote. Even as it stimulated his imagination and broadened perspective, Rafat's trip to the U.S. summoned pangs of regret. Like any other Palestinian academic, the occupation had cost him countless opportunities to study abroad and form relationships with his intellectual counterparts. In 2005, Israeli authorities refused to allow him to complete his master's degree in the United Kingdom. He lost an entire year of his studies along with his scholarship. Over the following 2 years, the Israelis refused to allow him to leave Gaza on 10 separate occasions. He remembered telling them, quote, if you have something against me, just put me in prison, end quote. When Rafat finally managed to secure permission to travel to the U.S. in 2014, Sarah Ali, a 22-year-old English literature student and teaching assistant at Islamic University who had contributed to Gaza Writes Back, was refused a permit to join him on the book tour. Thus, at events around the country, Rafat and his fellow Gaza's writers, Youssef and Rawan, delivered lectures next to a chair with a cardboard cutout that read, "Sarah Ali should be here." Next quote, "Israel wants us to be closed, isolated, to push us to the extreme," Rafat reflected. "It doesn't want us to be educated. It doesn't want us to see ourselves as part of a universal struggle against oppression. They don't want us to be educated or to be educators," end quote. When Rafat returned to his Gaza from the US, he redoubled his efforts to educate Gaza youth out of the narrow prejudices spawned in the seedbed of siege and occupation. At Islamic University, conservative higher education institution co-founded by the assassinated Hamas leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in 1978, Rafat introduced his students to Hebrew literature. Among the Jewish Israeli writers he assigned them was Yehuda Amichai, the legendary poet whose famed work, quote, "God has pity on the kindergarten children," end quote, tells of the short lives consumed in war and punctuated by intimate encounters with violence. The poem's opening stanzas resonated easily with Rafat's students. Quote, "God has pity on kindergarten children. He pities the school children less. But adults, he pities them not at all. He abandons them. And sometimes they have to crawl on all fours in the scorching sand to reach the dressing station, streaming with blood." Rafat also assigned his students The Merchant of Venice. He encouraged the class to view Shylock, Shakespeare's orientalized, vicarious Jewish character, as a sympathetic figure who had struggled to retain a modicum of dignity under an apartheid-like regime. When his students finished reading the play, Rafat asked them which Shakespearean character they sympathized with more, Othello, the Venetian general of Arab origin, or Shylock, the Jew. He described their responses as the most emotional moment of his 6-year teaching career. One by one, his students declared an almost visceral identification with Shylock. In her final paper, one of Rafat's students reworked Shylock's famous cri de coeur into an appeal to the consciousness of her own oppressors. Quote, "Hath not a Palestinian's eyes, hath not a Palestinian's hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subjected to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the winter and the summer. As a Christian or a Jew is, if you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge?" Rafat stored his students' papers in the desk at Islamic University's English department like small treasures. On August 2nd, the Israeli military bombed his department along with the university's administrative offices, sending those papers up in flames. The office, where students met him during office hours, was pulverized, and the student library next to the door was decimated. When Israeli army spokesman Peter Lerner claimed that the Air Force had targeted a, quote, weapons development center in the school, Rafat's students responded with sardonic humor, joking about the PMDs, or poems of mass destruction, they had been storing on campus. Quote, "Open-minded Palestinians are more dangerous," Rafat said, quote, "That's why Israel attacks the Islamic University. That's why it attacks other colleges. Of course, they lied when they attacked it. Rafat had seen his school attacked by Israeli forces before. He watched it be rebuilt, and he was summed, and he assumed it would be repaired again. But there was little that could console him over the violence that had sheared branch after branch of his family tree. During the war, he lost his brother-in-law, who also happened to be his best friend. He also learned that his cousin had been massacred in Shujaia. Faith al-Arir was among the survivors of Rafat's extended family, whom I interviewed in the rubble on August 14th. Next, he received news that his brother was killed. In the months after the war, his brother's young son, Ranim, slipped into a state of desolation. "I hate Dad," Ranim would mutter on a routine basis. "He won't come back." This next section is titled Holy Work. In early 2015, as electricity shortages plagued Gaza, I struggled to stay in touch with Rafat. His electricity came on for less than 6 hours at varying times depending on which day it was, leaving us with only a brief window of time to connect on Skype. When I finally reached him in late January, I found him coping with the malaise spreading all across Gaza after the war. His house and his neighbor's house had been bombed, forcing him to spend days at UNRWA offices attempting to negotiate the reconstruction process. It had taken 3 months to demolish a section of the family's home that threatened to collapse atop a passerby. Quote, "If it took that long, imagine how long the bureaucracy of getting it built again will take," Rafat sighed. One of Rafat's brothers lost his job when the ice cream factory he worked in was bombed by Israel. He was left to scramble to collect enough money just to pay his monthly rent. His father, who had not been able to find work in 20 years, depended on help from his unmarried sons. As dire as their situation had become, Rafat's family members considered themselves lucky compared to the thousands of government employees who had not worked in months and had no family assistance. Quote, "We always ask ourselves how they survive," Rafat said of the unpaid workers. Quote, "You get to the point that you will do anything for a buck. It's no surprise that crime is up, that domestic violence is up, that divorce is skyrocketing. Does the PA or Israel understand that sooner or later this will lead to an explosion?" End quote. With the Rafah border crossing almost hermetically sealed by the Egyptian junta, Rafat had a little chance of escaping Gaza to complete his PhD. His only release from frustration was in the classroom. As the siege tightened in the immediate aftermath of the war, he returned to Islamic University and redoubled his efforts to expand his students' intellectual horizons. Quote, "I find myself releasing most of my anger at the situation by teaching young people about the struggle and about being creative in the way we fight for our rights and freedom," Rafat said. Quote, "It's very rewarding." In December 2014, Rafat's class played host to my colleague Dan Cohen. Dan observed as Rafat presented his class with a story by one of his students, Noor El-Borno, written by the perspective of an Israeli veteran of an assault on the Gaza Strip. The soldier character had returned to his family in Israel plagued with post-traumatic stress disorder and consumed with nightmares about the children he had killed in Gaza. As the Palestinian children in his nightmares morphed into his own children, the soldier descended into madness. Had the story been written by an Israeli, it would have fit neatly into the country's hackneyed approach, shooting and crying literary subgenre, the most notable example being Waltz with Bashir, in which soldiers sought personal absolution through anguished confessions of crimes they committed against Palestinians and Lebanese civilians. Authored by a young Palestinian in Gaza taking on the perspective of an Israeli directly engaged in violence against her society. However, the narrative reflected in an unusual yearning to understand the psyche of the occupier. Rafat turned to his class and asked them if they could sympathize with the soldier in the story. A few students said they might be able to, but only on the condition that they were first released from the bonds of occupation. Others protested that the soldier was complicit in their oppression, that he was a baby killer who deserved to suffer for his crimes. An angry voice of a young woman suddenly rose above those of her classmates. "I hate them all," she exclaimed. She emphasized that she was referring to all Jews. Rafat took the opportunity to explain to the class that not all Jews were Zionists, and not all Zionists were Jews. He challenged them not to implicate an entire group for the cruelty of the state that claimed to be acting in the name of world Jewry. Quote, I told my students about my time in the U.S., staying with Jewish friends, being with their families, about seeing them defend Palestine. He recalled to me, quote, it's abstract to them because Israel won't even let my students travel to meet other people. Actually, 3 of my students have been prevented from leaving recently. But if these kinds of discussions help 10%, that's wonderful. Because later on, when they get to break the walls of isolation that the occupation in Egypt are creating, when they meet the Jewish people who are working for our cause, it's going to make all the difference. Towards the end of class, Rafat asked his students to raise their hands if they had lost their home or friends and family during the war. Most in the room threw a hand in the air. The young woman who declared her hatred for Jews had, in fact, lost her home in Shujaiya and witnessed the death of family members and neighbors. It clearly showed how Israeli violence is pushing everyone to the extreme, Rafat said. This war was so horrible, it really touched people. When the class was over, 15 young women in colorful headscarves and long dresses immediately surrounded Dan and began peppering him with questions. Quote, the class had apparently known that I was a Jew, Dan told me, and they wanted to know what I thought about them, about Gaza, about my life in the U.S. They had never met a Jew before, and they really showed me a lot of respect, end quote. The following day, the young woman who had declared her hatred for Jews approached Rafat to express her regret. Hearing herself verbalize her resentment left her feeling ashamed, and the meeting with Dan after class had provoked her to consider redirecting the anger that had gripped her after the war. Quote, Gaza is the most maligned place in the world, and if we were to believe that we were told by established Jewish groups in the U.S. and mainstream media, we would think that a Jew in Gaza would be ripped apart. The Gazans are running around looking for a Jew to kill, Dan reflected. Quote, in this supposed hotbed of anti-Semitism, everything was completely the opposite of the way I was told it was going to be. What I found were people like Rafat fighting to keep the violence that had consumed the physical lives of his students from consuming them internally. What he's doing is holy work. End quote. While some youth discovered outlets in intellectual life and online with social media, no one, no matter how educated or worldly, could escape the cloud of despair that settled over Gaza after the war. This next section is called Leaving Gaza. In the months after the 51-day war, thousands of Palestinians driven into the ruin by the onslaught attempted to escape Gaza through tunnels into Egypt, where they paid exorbitant fees to smuggling gangs for a place on a rickety boat to Europe. In September 2014, near the island of Malta, a rival smuggler rammed a boat filled with Palestinians fleeing Gaza and capsized it. 500 Palestinian passengers perished in the disaster. This has never happened before, said Sarah Roy, a senior research scholar at the Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies and a leading expert on Gaza's humanitarian situation. Quote, even in the worst of times, people never considered abandoning the Gaza Strip. End quote. As one of the hardest winters in record history descended on Gaza, electricity was reduced from 8 hours a day to around 4. Cooking gas was widely unavailable, even in central Gaza City, prompting some to consider lighting campfires in their freezing apartments. When he returned in January 2015 to the bloodlands of Quzaa, Dan Cohen found homeless families huddled in freezing shipping containers in the shadow of an Israeli sniper tower 200 meters away. Despite their desperate straits, one family boasted to Dan that the next time he visited them, their home would be rebuilt and grander than ever. All I could do was say, Inshallah, Dan recalled, because the reality is they are sentenced to a life in those shipping containers. Quote, being back with the rubble people reminded me of watching ants after some toddler kicked their anthill and they were trying to put it back together, end quote. He continued, quote, and then the toddler comes and kicks it again. People are trying to put their anthill back together and waiting for the next round that's going to completely destroy it, end quote. Our colleagues, journalists Jihad Saftawi and Lara Abu Ramadan, were among those seeking a way out of Gaza. The couple was preparing for a trip to the U.S., where they hoped to have a child whose American citizenship might afford it the freedom of movement and rights they had been denied. Mohammed Soliman, the young human rights researcher who had spent nights hanging out with us in Jihad's apartment, was planning to pursue his PhD in Australia. One by one, the best and the brightest of Gaza were planning to escape. But so far, neither Jihad or Lara nor Mohammed had reached the end of the bureaucratic maze they needed to navigate to secure exit visas. As I write this, in 2014, I have discovered another Gazan friend. The journalist Mohammed Amir was kidnapped outside his Gaza City home by thugs identifying themselves as affiliates of the Islamic State, IS. Amir said he was interrogated and tortured for several hours before being released at Al-Shifa Hospital. Amid a wave of mysterious bombings, the presence of ISIS-like elements in the tightly controlled enclave had spawned an array of theories about foreign meddling and intrigue aimed at destabilizing Hamas. More crucially, it had highlighted the intensification of a political radicalization born from rising desperation. As Israel headed for the national elections in March 2015, Zipi Livni, a leader of the supposedly left-of-center Zionist camp, suggested that war with Gaza was Israel's only option. Quote, Hamas is a terrorist organization, and there is no hope for peace with it. The only way to act against it is with force, end quote. She was echoed by her right-wing rival, foreign minister in Yisrael Beitenu, Yisrael Beitenu party leader Avigdor Lieberman. Quote, a fourth operation in Gaza is inevitable, he declared, just as a third Lebanon war is inevitable. Who will live when the next war comes down on Gaza, and who will die? In the time of siege, Israel will decide. So that's it. That's chapters 1 through 18 of The 51-Day War by Max Blumenthal. That was a lot. It's a hard book to read. A lot of really upsetting stories. But I hope anyone who's gone through and listened to any of these sections got something out of it, learned a bit of history, and hopefully it informed some perspectives on the occupation of Palestine. I guess that's it. Power to the people and free Palestine.